Hello everybody, I hope it's been a great day. So far it looks like it's been a good one. I'm looking forward to this panel. All my reporter friends in the room I know are looking from headlines from two ministers and a Vancouver councillor, so not to put the pressure on. If you are a climate change campaigner, if you are interested in climate change, and I think the political events of last year probably gave you great hope because we saw an election in the province that produces more greenhouse gas emissions than any other province produce a surprise victory for Rachel Notley and the NDP government. And of course, that was a government that came to power intent on cutting those emissions. And then, of course, a few months later, we saw Stephen Harper's Conservatives replaced with Justin Trudeau's Liberals, and a federal government that saw environment really as an issue where they played defense was replaced with a government, a federal government, that really played offense on environment, sees it as a core part of its character. And of course, that federal government has politically simpatico governments at Queen's Park, at Quebec City, throughout our Atlantic provinces. So all the stars were aligning, I assume, to many climate change campaigners that I spoke to. Many of you might have read the mandate letters that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gave to all his ministers. And if you read them, and they're great reading if you haven't got through them, there's one government-wide mandate that is loud and clear throughout them, and that is that Ottawa wants to reset the relationship between Canada and its Indigenous peoples. There's a second dominant theme that's kind of related to that first one that seems government-wide as well, and that is to address issues around climate change, regardless of what ministry you may be in. And we're going to hear from the lead minister on that file in a little bit. But it's top of mind now here in Ottawa. It's a top of mind issue in Alberta. It's a top of mind issue in a lot of municipalities as well. So, for you climate campaigners, much promise last year, much hope. Stuff was going to get done. And now we're going to have a little gut check time. Is stuff getting done? That's the big question. Can we say that after years in which we saw federal governments, and I say governments, both the last one as well as Chrétien and Martin governments, where we saw federal governments foot dragging on the issue of climate change, are we finally going to see some hashtag real change on the file? And so that is the nub of our discussion this afternoon. Are we turning the climate for real? And we're lucky to have the panel beside me. It's a great panel. We're going to have, they're not only at the center of discussions on climate change in their own governments, they've been at the center of discussions across the country, internationally, so they know what's going on. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. Shannon Phillips is Alberta's Minister of Environment and Parks, and she's the minister responsible for the Climate Change Office in that province. Minister Phillips, welcome. Minister Phillips was elected MLA for Lethbridge West in last year's Alberta provincial election, and prior to her election, Minister Phillips was an economic policy analyst for the Alberta Federation of Labor. For fun, Wikipedia tells me she's into roller derby. Very cool. Andrea Reimer was, she's sitting in the middle there, was first elected to Vancouver City Council in 2008. She was re-elected in 2011, re-elected again in 2014. She's a member of the Vision Vancouver Party, and of course that's the party of Vancouver Mayor Gregor Robertson, and I think it's the majority party on Vancouver City Council. Councillor Reimer had previously served as a school board member with the Green Party from 2002 to 2005. And I just point that out, New Democrat, Green, Liberal. So we got a little bit of a progressive spectrum here. And I'd like to read you the three commitments that Councillor Reimer made when she first ran for Vancouver City Council, if you're not familiar with her career. She promised she'd turn Vancouver into the greenest city on earth, a city of compassion and opportunity, and a city of strong communities. That sounds to me like a wonderful place to live if only I could afford to live in Vancouver. That would be the issue there. Catherine McKenna is the Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and she is the MP for Ottawa Centre, winning there for the first time last fall. And of course, it was a little bit of a political sea change here in Ottawa Centre, as you may have heard. That is the riding once held by some guy named Ed Broadbent, who I understand spoke to you this morning. Minister McKenna came to elected office after, well, I guess I shouldn't say after, but Minister McKenna came to office in the midst of a distinguished legal career, which she worked on social and human rights issues here and abroad, most notably with a UN peacekeeping team in East Timor. And while Minister Phillips is a mean roller skater, Minister McKenna is a mean swimmer. She was captain at the U of T of her champion varsity swim team, I understand, has crossed the Ottawa River in a bathing suit. That takes something to do. So there we are, swimming.
Better than naked.
Better, yes, exactly, there you are. Now, we've asked, each of our panelists are going to make some introductory remarks, and then we'll have a discussion. Those of you who have been through the sessions this morning know that you can use that app that's up on the screen to type some questions. It'll be sort of group sourced what questions we want to talk to, and I'll try and put some to our panelists. My job as moderator is any moderator. They're going to get 5 minutes each. I've got my iPhone timed at 5 minutes, and we will try and stop at 4 p.m. this afternoon. So thank you all for being here, and thank you panelists for joining us. And Minister Phillips, I invite you to the podium.
I just want to check that I don't have both mics on. It's all good? Okay, it doesn't sound funny? All right. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to my first Progress Summit. This afternoon, I want to start by sharing with you a little bit about what's happening in my province right now, and how Alberta's new government, led by Premier Rachel Notley, is facing the challenges head-on. An update on the economic situation, I think, is really, really important, even as we frame the conversation around climate, because the economy is not great for Alberta right now. And I think it's important for all of us to appreciate what's happening to the Alberta member of our Canadian family. Alberta is in the midst of the worst economic downturn we have seen since the 1980s. We have had $10 billion of royalty revenue drained from our treasury. The impact of the drastic and rapid collapse of the oil price has had a real and devastating effect on families and on working people. We have seen thousands of those who work in the oil and gas sector lose their good-paying, family-sustaining jobs. Families are losing their homes and vehicles. The number of people using food banks is rising. Incidents of domestic violence are rising, even as charitable donations are down. That is the context. And so there have been two commitments made by the NDP government in Alberta. And yes, you are permitted to take a moment to let that phrase still set in. When times are tough, we have each other's backs. We have said exactly that phrase in our speech from the throne. Our government will deliver in 2 weeks' time a budget that will reject the mean and short-sighted politics of austerity and ensure to the best of our ability that we provide stable healthcare, education, and social services funding. That we invest in infrastructure and affordable housing, in a green economy, and putting money in the pockets of the lowest income citizens, which we will be doing with the upcoming new child benefit that will go to 380,000 families. We are very proud of this. Struggling Alberta families will have more support from their government, and we will reduce inequality and economic security, especially during this recession. The second thing that you will see our government has committed to and will remain committed to is that the collapse in the price of oil is an object lesson in the need to diversify the Alberta economy. It is a long dream in Alberta politics, stretching back to Lougheed, that diversification is urgent. It is even more urgent now, given the economic and environmental imperative of carbon constraints. So, in November of last year, Premier Notley and I stood with environmental groups from across the country, Grand Chief of Treaty 6 and Canadian oil companies to announce the Climate Leadership Plan. The plan centers on an economy-wide price on carbon, the phase-out of coal-fired electricity. Alberta burns more coal than the rest of the country combined. We'll be phasing that out in favor of finally, in our province, saying yes to renewables and green energy investments. We will also undertake a methane reduction strategy, which was later carbon copied by Prime Minister Trudeau and President Obama. So you're welcome, Minister. And of course, we made a commitment to investing in efficiency, in research and development, in technology, in Indigenous communities, municipalities, and rural communities. In other words, Alberta committed to doing our share as an energy economy within the Canadian Federation. The Climate Leadership Plan represents Alberta's best hope for realizing that great dream of diversification. It represents our ability to put people back to work in my province, to stabilizing income for so many people. It represents our best hope for using the energy and ingenuity of the youngest, best educated population in Canada. There is a new wind in Canadian federalism as well, and I want to conclude with a thought on that. Alberta's approach on climate diplomacy is to turn the page on the failed conservative strategies of the past. Alberta's approach is one of respectful determination. We have already demonstrated that we are willing to make tough choices and lead the country on climate policy. We are willing to face the past criticisms from civil society, from our trading partners, and make the changes necessary to ensure a more thoughtful conversation about Alberta's energy resources and their contribution to the Canadian economy. The chest-beating rhetoric coming from Alberta Conservatives is not helpful at any level of government, was never helpful either to this specific debate or anywhere in politics, in my view. There must be a place in Canadian politics for respectful cooperation and engagement between the federal government, the provinces and territories, and First Nations governments. As I observed to Minister McKenna at our first Environment Ministers meeting, this is not your father's federalism. I think what you can expect from Alberta is what I am calling the Notley Doctrine in federalism, which is, in essence, a tantrum-free zone for working out the future of the Canadian family. So I'm sure we'll speak of many things in the Q&A this afternoon, but what I want to leave you with is that the province of Alberta is facing a number of very serious economic challenges. We are grappling with a recession the likes of which we have not seen since my own dad lost his job as an oil field electrician in the early 1980s. Amid that turmoil, we will move ahead with the climate leadership plan that will put Albertans back to work and open the door to a greener economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Councillor Reimer, your turn.
Thank you, David. It's an honor to be joining two ministers here today from the City of Vancouver, the unceded homelands of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations. And I wanted to give my thanks to the Progress Summit for providing the welcome to this territory earlier today. I wanted to thank the minister. My mom was actually one of those people who lost her job in the 80s in the recession. So although I don't live in Alberta now, I certainly remember what those times were like. And I think you painted a good picture of what the challenges are. And we're such a big country, sometimes we forget that, well, one part may be experiencing one set of circumstances. There's other circumstances that are being experienced, and part of the challenge is how we all come together and feel those experiences and find those solutions together. I wanted to start by sharing some of our green success in Vancouver, but as the city representative on the panel, I felt it was fairly important to note that unlike provincial and federal governments, or House of Cards, or some of the things you might see on TV about governments, cities cannot legislate people to act, nor do we have any fiscal tools that are designed to empower action on green, or finance action for that matter. So any success that municipal governments have, in fact, at anything, is more accurately a triumph of community and collaboration, and not the success of a mayor or a councillor or even the group of staff we have in Vancouver are phenomenal. And it's not to say that these folks can't have community successes, but to say that in order for cities to be successful, we must have community successes. So in 2009, Vancouver made the commitment to be the greenest city on earth by the year 2020. In the past 6 years since we made that commitment, we've directly engaged over 35,000 residents, 180 different organizations, and undertaken over 150 different policy initiatives across 10 broad environmental policy areas that have gotten results. We've seen an 18% reduction in water use, an 18% reduction in waste, 10% per capita reduction in greenhouse gases. We're at 4.2 tons per capita, and to compare that to somewhere you guys might be familiar with, Toronto's at 7.2 tons per capita. We've seen a 7% decrease overall in greenhouse gas emissions, and the discrepancy there is because our population and economy continue to grow, the fastest in Canada right now, because of the focus that we've had on diversifying and creating a resilient economy, growing on a resource economy that we had ourselves in the 90s that had some challenges. Largely, I will admit, as an environmentalist who fought hard to reform the forest industry, it was actually the world markets that did that job for us. But we as a city now have to figure out how to make the economy work. And those new jobs that we have include 3,900 new green jobs. And we've already reached some of our 2020 goals. In May 2015, we were able to announce that we had hit 50% trips by bike, walking, or transit, and we've reduced the vehicle kilometers traveled in the city by more than the 20% goal that we had set for the year 2020. When we started doing this work, we didn't even appear on the global rankings, which only rank the top 500 cities in the world. Now Vancouver is ranked as the 4th greenest city on Earth, despite being located in a country that up until, let's say, 6 months ago, had one of the most environmentally irresponsible national governments in the world, and located in a province where the so-called Liberal government bears as much resemblance to the federal Liberals as progressive Conservatives did to progressives. We are only one city. So we're only one city, and we are proving, though, that people will act if they can see that leadership is willing to embrace big, bold goals, take that leadership, and give people the tools that they need to act. We also know that leadership cannot stop at the city's borders. And indeed, the Greenest City initiatives have inspired cities, regions, provinces, and countries around the world. We have had over 2,000 inquiries from governments interested in replicating part or all of the success of the Greenest City. So we were thinking, if we're going to do all this work and talk to all these governments around the world, what is one ask that we could give to the world community about what we would like to see as Vancouver as we're supporting them in greening their cities? So the obvious answer for us, and I think it's probably the big elephant in the room here today, is that we could really use some help fighting against a pipeline that would bring a 7-fold increase in liquid tar through lands and waters in the Vancouver region. But here's the thing, simply asking people to fight more climate-destroying fossil fuel infrastructure is a weak ask. First off, there are people all over the planet fighting against fossil fuel infrastructure, and why should they care about our pipeline when they're fighting coal plants and so-called waste-to-energy incinerators and other forms, liquefied natural gas, other forms of a past economy and a dying industry. And that dying industry has a lot of money to fight for its survival. Second, fighting against things, and I will tell you this as someone who's been fighting for the greenest city on earth for the last 6 years after working as an environmental advocate for a long time, fighting for something is way more fun than fighting against something. So last year, Vancouver made the commitment to 100% renewable energy and have been spreading that aspiration to the world. We are really done with the debate around whether if climate change is happening or what the solution is. It's really simple. If greenhouse gases are killing us, then the solution is to stop burning the fossil fuels that create them. So we're down now to a few questions. Questions of who, when, and where. The time, the atmosphere is deciding this timeline, not any of us up on stage. The time is definitely now. We have renewed hope that the where will be Canada, and the only question now for us is who has the courage to say that we have to be done living in denial about fossil fuels, then that we're ready to own a future which is 100% powered by renewable energy, and we offer our help on how to help the people on stage and other governments get to yes on who's going to be the who. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Reimer. Minister McKenna.
Thank you, David. So one of the really awesome things about working on climate change is how many amazing women you get to work with. And I'll say that that was true in Paris, it's true here, and what's great about them is that they are passionate, they are hardworking, they are practical, and they are tantrum-free. So I want to start by recognizing we're on the territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabes peoples. It's really important because climate change, we know that Indigenous peoples are being affected more than anyone else by climate change, and they also have solutions. And we need to be working with them, and that is a commitment with our government. And I do encourage you to read the mandate letters, because that's, as I tell everyone, I tell all the amazing public servants I work with, I tell my staff, that's the chapeau we're working under. I have a lot of deliverables, that you may have seen, but on top of that is how we act as a government, how we work towards reconciliation, and that is really important throughout everything we do. So I think the question really was, okay, what, are you guys doing anything on climate change? Are you serious? So I'll start in Paris. We went to Paris, I went to Paris 2 days after I was named to cabinet. And I didn't really, I hadn't been to 12 COPs. There's like a whole cult of people who've been to many COPs. This was new to me, but it was quite clear that we were committed as a government, and I didn't go alone. We went with premiers, I went with my counterparts, environment ministers, went with members of the opposition. Elizabeth May and I are like this, we swim every Thursday together. Nothing like being in a bathing suit with Elizabeth May is like, you must know this, Catherine. It's always very helpful, though. We went with Indigenous leaders, members. We went with youth. We went with environmental NGOs. We went with business. And that's what I intend to keep on doing. Climate change is it's not a partisan file. It should not be a partisan file. We all know we need to act. And what's really quite astonishing is that while people come from different perspectives, and you're going to hear different perspectives on the stage, I think everyone knows we need to take action, and we need to take action now. And so I see my job as kind of a convener, and finding a path forward where we're now bringing Paris back home. And let me tell you, Paris was pretty hard at 6 a.m., some of the discussions we were having, and it's going to be hard here at home, but I'm very optimistic. And we did get a really great agreement. So I think most people, if you look at the Paris Agreement, committing to having every single country, 195 countries, commit to a climate change plan where they're going to reduce emissions, where we're going to make sure that we keep the temperature below 2 degrees, striving for 1.5, which requires us to come back and do better every 5 years. We all know that. In the UN context, that's almost impossible. So be optimistic about that. We have to be optimistic. We then came back home and we had our first ministers meeting. And you should be optimistic about that, because imagine the conversation when Stéphane Dion was talking about putting a price on carbon. Do you remember that election? Didn't go so well. So we actually now have all the premiers and all the premiers and territories. Everyone recognizes that we need to take action, that we need to make our international commitment, and that part of that is putting a price on carbon and a whole range of other measures. So that is huge progress. We were just in Washington. In Washington, we got an agreement, and the agreement involved a whole range of measures, but one of that was reducing methane emissions. And I have to give a shout out. Shannon, you're right, we did copy you, but I feel like I'm happy to copy whoever has the best ideas out there. But the reductions, if we were able to translate that agreement globally, which is our plan as a government, we're going to be pushing to do that, that would be like closing 1/3 of the coal plants. So that's a really important measure. We're also aligning vehicle standards. We're doing a number of other things, including in the Arctic. So now, where are we at? Now we're going into the really tough part. In the next 6 months, we're going to be sitting down and discussing what actual measures we need to take. And everyone wants to see a target, I get it, and everyone wants it to be ambitious, and I get it, but I am a practical person. And so the only way you figure out how much you can do is having a plan to get there. And I think Canadians want to see the money. They want to see, what are you doing, how are you going to get there? And so we have working groups that are set up. This was agreed at the First Ministers meeting in 4 different areas. So there's a carbon pricing group. There's a group on other mitigation measures, so clearly there's a whole range of other measures we can take to reduce emissions. There's a working group on adaptation, which is a key issue across the country. We've talked about massive flooding. PEI is receding at 43 centimeters a year, and the permafrost is melting. So, I mean, we have a catastrophe here in Canada, not just around the world. And then the fourth group is really important. It's about clean growth, innovation, and jobs. And I think that's a piece we don't talk enough about, that this isn't just this massive challenge, it's actually a huge economic opportunity for Canada. And we need to frame it like that. We need to take this as the whole world is going in a direction, and we need to be part of it, because those are the jobs of the future. Those are the jobs that I hope my 3 kids have, and we cannot be left behind. And so, you know, these are going to be some tough discussions for sure, but there's a huge opportunity. And at the end of it, at the end of this 6-month period, we're going to be presenting, environment ministers are going to be presenting to our bosses, the Prime Minister and the Premiers, the plan. And that's where you're going to see the real concrete actions. I should say our government has already taken, beyond the actions internationally, a lot of actions domestically. So if you just have a look at our budget, you can look at a whole of government approach to climate change. You know, there's huge, significant, historic investments in infrastructure, green infrastructure, public transit, social infrastructure, and I can tell you, I worked very, very hard to make sure that social infrastructure, it was 100% clear that it had to be energy efficient, the highest standard, because that just makes economic sense. I know that because we're an Ottawa Centre, so the best riding in the world. But my office is social housing, and there, when I talk to the provider, they say that it's so much less expensive because they built it to the highest standards, so it means lower costs for the residents. And so all of this is a package, and I'll just leave you with one thought. So when we went to Paris, we asked everyone, Canadians, send us tweets, videos, send us whatever, you know, your ideas about why we need to take action or what actions we can take. And I got a video from grade 6 students from Sherbrooke. And it was a video where they played the song Plus Rien par les Cowboys Fringants. And in the song, it's kind of the apocalypse, end of the world, only one man is alive. And it's because short-sighted leaders refuse to take action. And what really struck me is that there's, at one point, there's just a young boy, and he's holding up a sign, and it says, Deux choses infinies, l'univers et les bêtises de l'homme. The universe and the follies of man. And it really struck me because this is the biggest challenge of our time, and I have 3 kids, and it's really about what kind of world are we leaving to them? Are we going to leave them a planet that ultimately is going to be gone and they're going to be facing huge catastrophes? Are we going to take the opportunity to create a sustainable future for them? And I think that's really the challenge. So I encourage all of you to remain optimistic and to work with me and to work with Shannon and to work with Andrea and to get everyone on board. And by that, I want unusual suspects working together, because that is the only way we will make progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. So once again, I've got some questions, but I hope you may have some questions for our panelists. And once again, there's that app. If you don't have a phone or a computer in which to type in your question and feed it through the system to me, you can write it down, and I think there's some ushers sort of hanging around the room, and put your usher hands up, and they'll be happy to take your question as well. I'm going to start with one, and I'm going to start with Minister McKenna. I know you're working towards the framework we're going to see later on in the year, and you're going to tell us then what's going to be in it. So I'm not going to ask you what's going to be in it. But if I might tease you about maybe what won't be in it, and I wonder specifically on, let me ask you the broad question. Is everything and anything essentially on the table in that framework in terms of carbon pricing mechanisms, you name it, to achieve targets?
Yeah. I mean, this is, so I also often hear, you know, this is an ambitious target set by the previous government. If you have a target based on 2005 and you do nothing for 10 years and you go in the wrong direction, suddenly it becomes actually a hard target. So everything has to be on the table, including carbon pricing. And I'll be very clear about carbon pricing. I have businesses telling me all the time they internally price carbon and is the most cost-efficient measure to foster innovation and reduce emissions. So yes, does that mean there won't be hard conversations? No.
Are the hard conversations about the actual cost, or is it about the mechanism, cap and trade versus a carbon tax? Can you give us some insight as to where the hardest part of that conversation is occurring, the actual cost or the method by which we cost it?
Well, so if we're only talking about carbon pricing, we're coming really late. And so we've had leadership from the provinces. Provinces like Alberta have stepped up, BC, Ontario, Quebec. The challenge is we now have different systems in place with different prices, and so you have carbon pricing, carbon tax, and then you have provinces that aren't there yet. So we need to talk about all of it, and so I think there's discussion about what's the mechanism, can there be different mechanisms, what the price is. I mean, I just care about how do we reduce emissions at the end of the day. That is the most important piece, but it is a conversation that there's a diversity of views. And we will, over the 6 months, we will have experts. There's a lot of really great experts out there that are doing really good work, and we'll be taking that input.
I want to take that then and take it to the province of Alberta. As you look to that target and the mechanisms to get there, one of my favorite commentators on energy issues is a professor in your province, Andrew Leach. Many of you may know Professor Leach's work, and he helped, I think.
Chaired the panel.
Exactly, chaired the panel that you guys went through. One of the things he said when he testified at a House of Commons committee was, if the whole world did what Canada does, and we got to our targets, then that's the plan Canada should adopt. This goes to the question of what should Canada do? What should our role do? So whatever we adopt, if the whole world adopted it, we'd hit global targets. Now, if the whole world adopted what Alberta has done, we would not hit targets. In other words, what your government has done is great, it's a huge step forward, but it's not sufficient, and it would require other provinces in the Federation to do a little bit more to still pick up some Alberta slacks. So, with the compliment of well done, what's next for Alberta?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And what Leach was talking about there, and it does actually form the crux of the policy package that we put forward, which is that Alberta has an economy that is a large chunk of the GDP is energy-intensive, trade-exposed. And so that's the oil sands, it's also petrochemicals, cement, fertilizer, et cetera. And so that's the situation that we have inherited, 10 months ago. And so because of that, we have to price carbon thoughtfully in ways that it doesn't simply result in carbon leakage to other places. And that has to be done thoughtfully. And so that's what he's talking about there. And so that's why we've adopted the system that we have, right, with a set of performance measures and an economy-wide price and so on. We are aware that this is the first step, and we are also aware that other provinces need to move as well. And I think the bigger thing, the bigger unknown for us when people say to us, well, is it enough? I think that there's a great deal of effects of a positive change that we will see through diversification and some of the spin-offs that will come from a thoughtfully designed carbon pricing system and invested appropriately back within the economy. And so, I think there's many things that we cannot predict in those emissions curves. One is, of course, the price of oil. The other is the actions of the federal government and what effect they will have. And then what effect some of the research and technology and those pieces will have as well on decarbonizing the barrels we do pull out of the ground right now, and ensuring that we are growing the economy in other ways to contribute to the GDP in ways that are greener and cleaner.
All right, thank you, Shannon. We're going to get a question in a second. I want to put one more to Councillor Reimer. I'm glad you brought up the fact that municipalities, where the rubber often hits the road, often doesn't have the tax capacity to do the things that municipalities want to do, or the lawmaking capacity. And as you mentioned, there's a situation where you've got a progressive council and a progressive mayor with, as you characterize, an unprogressive provincial government in Victoria. What are some strategies then to do what Alberta did, which was to bring that great consensus of the oil industry together with environmentalists to actually agree on something? Can places like Vancouver get along with the legislature in Victoria?
Yeah, well, I mean, it took until Harper was gone for me to admit this, but I'm big enough to admit this now. I don't think I realized it when the Conservatives were in power. They actually did us a huge favor. Like, cities in Canada spend a lot of time waiting for the feds or the province or whatever. We knew that cavalry, like, they were staying in Ottawa, right? If we were lucky, they wouldn't come over the hill with something bad. So what if...
You did send a lot of Conservatives to Ottawa, though. BC did do a fair bit of that, but nonetheless.
Yeah. So from our perspective, we knew we had to do it alone, right? And that actually was quite liberating, because there was like, what are the tools we have? How do we asset map? Like, how are we going to bring the business community and the labor unions and the faith groups and the cultural communities and the low income and the more affluent people, and like, how are we going to make this all work in, as you point out, a context where affordability is always going to be the front page of every newspaper, unless we put in a new bike lane, in which case it gets bumped off for a few days, and then we're back on affordability. So I think, like, it's a great roadmap in this new federalism, where there's 4 key ingredients. There's leadership, clear targets. The leader must lead, and I think we've seen that in both cases of the Alberta and federal government. You've got a plan, and we have a saying that some is not a number and soon is not a time, like when and how much and how are you reporting so the public can hold you accountable. You have action, so it's not just about what you'd like to do, but what you are doing. And then it's about partnerships and how you empower those partners to do the work. It's been, as you heard from our results, going from nowhere to 4th in the world with a Conservative government in power nationally. And I'll tell you, the other 3 cities have a lot more supportive federal frameworks that they're working with that are ahead of us. It is no small feat, and it gave me a lot of hope that Canada can get there regardless of the things we fight about.
Can I just say something?
Yes, please, go ahead,
I didn't talk
Minister.
enough about this. We talk a lot about the federal government and the provinces working together, but you're absolutely right. And it is amazing to see the leadership at the city level. We work closely with Vancouver and looking at what you've done to actually do what we have to do. And I'm hoping that many cities are doing that. Ottawa now has jumped on board, but having hard targets and figuring out how you're going to do it, because it's important that we all do our part, but it demonstrates that there's a real commitment. And I've seen this. I've seen labor, faith groups, certainly cities, provinces. Everyone really is getting on board. And I think for a long time it was very abstract, like, what can we do to tackle climate change? When you actually have cities saying, okay, this is our emissions now, and now we've got a target, and now we have to have a plan together. I think it's a very useful exercise to make it very concrete for people. And I have to hand it out to Vancouver. Like, you guys have been leading the way on this through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And I'm hoping now every city and municipality will do the same exercise that you're doing, that Alberta's doing, that we're doing.
But, Minister McKenna, let me pick up on something then where your government particularly, I think, has an issue in many areas, and this is that. If you look at any riding in the country that finishes with centre, Kitchener Centre, Ottawa Centre, Edmonton Centre, Vancouver Centre, you name it, all Liberals, every single one of them, downtown Halifax, even though it's not called Halifax. But a lot of the climate change problem that you have to regulate and deal with is in agriculture, still a big producer of greenhouse gas emissions. In rural parts of Alberta, of course, as you all know, Minister Phillips. How does your government then, seen largely as a very urban government, and reach out to people living in rural northern Canada, talk about Aboriginal communities, still a lot of them using diesel to heat so many places. How do you build those bridges and get buy-in from people who will never ever be able to use public transit, or unlikely they'll be able to use public transit, or do some of those other things that center dwellers can so easily adapt to?
It's interesting because I don't see it that it's just people, who live in major centers who are on board, because, as I say, like, we have everyone. Like, I feel like there's just this moment in time where so many people are committed. Like, as I say, faith groups. I have kids. I have farmers. I mean, farmers, if you're seeing flooding like this, I mean, how are you going to be able, to make ends meet? Crops are being destroyed. And unfortunately, we're at the situation where I think everyone's seeing it's up close and real. So that makes a really big difference. When it comes to Indigenous communities, I mean, we have conversations all the time. I was just meeting with a group this morning, right? And they were saying, a community, and they were saying, like, we need to take action and we want to be part of the solution. And diesel, that was a commitment of our government. As I say, it's a whole of government approach to this. So getting northern communities off diesel, they want to get off diesel. They just need help to do it. And that's where the federal government, really can play a role. It's amplifying a lot of the measures that are already happening at the city and at the provincial level. And as I say, it's a bit like Paris coming home, because we have provinces and territories and cities and that have very different economic profiles. And I think that's really, really important. Like what Shannon said, Alberta is going through a pretty tough time. So is Saskatchewan, so is Newfoundland and Labrador. That's not to say other places aren't, but it's very different with low commodity prices. And so I think we need to figure out, how do we support governments in what they're trying to do? So it's not just the federal government coming in and being the hammer. Having said that, we have to meet our international commitments. So we also have to be realists, and there will be some tough choices to make.
I'm going to go to a question we've had from the audience. I'm going to put this to you, Minister Phillips, just on the issue that's been in front of us for a bit. To do this, we need massive energy change beyond just perhaps going through coal-fired power plants. And there's some worry about the idea of how do we avoid greenwash projects? How do we avoid the idea that we're just doing this to, just make ourselves feel good, essentially?
Well, I'm not sure that anyone brings in a carbon levy in Alberta, David, in order to make themselves feel good.
Touche there.
So there's that. How we do this is we move forward thoughtfully in partnership with municipalities, with rural communities, with First Nations, and so on. We make sure that that the investments we make are thoughtful and they are real, and that is what we've committed to. Stay tuned to the budget, and we'll have more to say about that then. But we have said, look, there is a role for adjustment to carbon pricing. Right? There is a role for ensuring that low and middle income families are not having trouble making ends meet as a result of this policy. So there's a role for that. And then there's a role for investment because we are starting from quite far back in Alberta with respect to energy efficiency, with respect to our greener infrastructure, all of those pieces we have not undertaken with any level of seriousness prior to a few months ago. And so, I think that that's how you guard against that, is you ensure that you are making the investments as the Leach panel recommended in the lowest cost areas to the economy, so the cheapest energy efficiency reductions that you can make. So that's methane. And so that's, for us, it's some of the research and technology in the oil sands. For us, it's coal-fired electricity. And it's certainly making robust investments in cities and towns that the previous government, sort of took a pass on doing. So that's the approach that we've taken. We're going to reinvest that price on carbon in things that we know are proven in other jurisdictions to reduce GHG emissions. One
of the things, Councillor, I just want to talk, you mentioned just briefly about accountability as many of the things as you're designing projects. And I wonder if that may be the most important thing to get skeptics, opponents to buy into any plan, a green plan, to say, if we get these resources, funding, staff, whatever, we will accomplish these objectives, and we have a way to measure these objectives, and we'll show you how we did it. Has that been something you've been involved with in Vancouver?
Yeah, well, so I spent the first, 6 to 12 months of the Greenest City Initiative standing on stages talking about, we wanted to be the greenest city, and everyone would be like, why would we want to do that? We're Canadians, we're not the Est at anything, and
right.
The affordability and Olympics and blah, blah, blah. And then I spent the next year having people go, oh, okay, because by then the targets were out, and people were like, okay, well, those seem I feel like I can buy into those, right? So what do you need from me? And now the thing I get all the time from some of our biggest critics at the outset is, why aren't we there yet, right? People who thought it was a complete waste of time to try and be the greenest city, which I love it. I love to know that they've...
So number 4 is a big disappointment now to a lot of people.
They really kind of internalized it, and it's part of who our identity now as a city. And it really just... setting the targets, reporting out on them, being willing to I think part of the challenge for governments around accountability is being public about your failures, because we have had failures. We had spectacular failure in our retrofits that we tried to cobble together, minus federal and provincial government help. Turns out it doesn't work, right? But now we know that. So we know what doors we're going to be knocking on, and we know how to build a program that will work over time. And I think the more that we're clear about where we're going, how far we've gotten, what the barriers are to not getting there, the more the public, I mean, yes, government partners, but the more the public can partner with us. And it's ultimately everybody who's living in Canada who's going to have to choose the bus, the bike, the lower or higher efficiency housing, or whatever it is that we're asking them to do to be part of this fight against climate change.
Excellent. We've got some more questions. A lot of you are asking about the role of First Nations in GHG reduction, relations between governments. And so let me put that kind of topic, Minister McKenna, to you. If you can take us a little bit inside the cabinet room, I mentioned in those mandate letters that First Nations, every minister has a mandate to improve the relationship between Ottawa and First Nations. That's common to everybody.
Yep.
And as I mentioned, the second thing seemed to me was also be thinking about GHG. So take us in there. Is that something that you're seeing? If Minister Garneau, the Transport Minister, is talking about something, or something's coming up, or the Health Minister, Minister Phillips, she's clearly involved in a whole lot of things. Give me your flavor of what's going on in the cabinet. Are people talking about this relationship rebuild?
So all the time. So first of all, I'm like a broken record in the cabinet room. So kind of what happens in the cabinet room stays in the cabinet room.
Yeah, I know.
Beyond,
we're all friends here. You can tell us a little bit.
Beyond that, I'm actually very into metric. Like I don't actually care. I hate green. I hate that word. I was like, I don't care about green. Are you reducing emissions? So now everyone is obsessed with. They're trying to show like in the budget, to get money that we're going to reduce emissions. So that warms my heart. In terms of the relationship with Indigenous peoples, they are very much involved in all our conversations, like beyond climate change, and the number of communities I've met with, and they said like, wow, this is like a minister meeting, like this has never, this hasn't happened in the last decade, which is totally bizarre because often, whether it's a big project or it's, talking about the impact of climate change in a northern community, they really need to be part of the conversations. And so with this working group process, Indigenous groups are directly involved, and we will have communities being able to play in too. I mean, we have quite a tight time frame, but there's already the structure includes engagement directly with the three major Indigenous groups, but everyone, all the communities, there'll be an outreach program so that we can reach everyone and get their input and their solutions and how we move forward. And this also extends to, we're not talking about this really, but environmental assessments. Hugely important that that we're working with the communities.
Do First Nations groups generally have the resources at this point to participate fully in environmental assessment processes?
Well, we just put more money in the budget for that, and then for
I gave
the
you a lot
climate,
ball there for that one. Yeah,
on the clean, yeah, thank you, got it. No, for the climate, but also on climate engagement, it's very expensive. So
Right.
we've just allocated, I think, $1 million for engagement. That through that mechanism. And it's tough because there's also a capacity issue. We've got 4 working groups, and in mitigation, we've got 7 sub-working groups. So, you're playing into, very specific areas, and so we're trying to support that way. But just making sure that they're absolutely at the table and part of the conversation, which is so critical to moving forward on this file.
Minister Phillips, I wonder if you have some thoughts on that, and let me recast it slightly. In that if you watch politics within Indigenous communities, there's a lot of people who think the Assembly of First Nations is just like the rest of us. They're out of touch with grassroots people in Indigenous communities. There is different sort of tribal arrangements that are often at odds with each other. In other words, there's just not one First Nations community. They are having discussions in their own communities. How do you as a government look out and say, well, how do we interact with such a diverse and sometimes complex group to make sure we're hitting all the stakeholders as best we can?
Well, we are undertaking a number of sort of more overarching frameworks in order to make good on our commitments to the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a commitment we made in the platform. Instead of being at that 30,000-foot level of the Minister of Indigenous Relations, I'll just tell you what I did.
Sure.
So, for example, in Lower Athabasca, there were a number of First Nations and Métis organizations who had concerns about monitoring, about industrial development and so on, and triggered a review of the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan. So instead of, and I received that review like a couple of weeks after getting into cabinet, so it was very definitely a creature of the previous government. So what I did was I took it to those communities, the communities who did the interventions, and I said, all right, We have these problems. These issues are well matured. They have been well canvassed. We all know what they are. And so let's work together on how we're going to solve them. I put some potential solutions to them, said, what do you think about this or this? Okay, we will move forward that way. And I went around to every single one of them. And some of those folks told me that even when their own MLA was a minister, they had never met a minister in Alberta before. So that's just what we're working from here. And so I think that, yes, of course, there are overarching frameworks and there are questions of funding and capacity and so on. But in my province and from my experience so far, I think what's most important is that the government-to-government relationship actually be just that.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to spend a little time. Oh, yeah, sorry, Councillor Reimer. Sure, go ahead, please, jump in.
I did just want to jump in on the First Nations question to share. On the coast, we have a tradition in Coast Salish of witnessing, and to share something I witnessed at the Climate Summit of Americas, which was Chief Ava Hill from the Six Nations, who said, she was giving remarks for the day, and she said, First Nations is disproportionately impacted by climate change. And we've all heard that, right? And people clap, and they're like, yep, that's true. And then she paused and she said, and we are disproportionately being negatively impacted by the solutions. And I think it's critical that we remember that, right? That we are not doing solutions for First Nations on climate because they're more impacted. We need to reframe, and I think both governments have done a good job of it, but it is about reframing that relationship, right? We need to work together on things. And most importantly, I think, to support and empower First Nations and any community that's organized to support themselves in getting where they need to go on whatever those solutions are. I know in Vancouver we actually have a First Nations whose reserve lands are entirely within city limits, so we have this opportunity as well with the government-to-government and the other two nations whose homelands would be City of Vancouver, to create the space for them, like all residents, to bring forward their own energy projects, their own solutions, whatever they are. We have one of our nations, the Tsleil-Waututh, has really led on this idea that, this is a crazy, fantastic idea that one day their children will be able to eat shellfish out of the Burrard Inlet again because the water will be that healthy. But what an incredible vision to be advancing on all of our behalf, because I would like my child to be able to enjoy the health of that inlet at that level as well. So it really is about not just partnership, not inviting them to our table, but respecting that they have a table and we have to show up there as well.
We've only got about 10 minutes left. Thank you, Councillor. We've got about 10 minutes, and I do want to sort of connect the climate change work that all three of you are doing with the sort of the yin to the yang, that is energy development. You know this as well as anybody, Minister Phillips, that's your province's bread and butter. Councillor Reimer, you mentioned in your opening remarks, I think you referred to the Kinder Morgan pipeline, and of course that, as everybody here may knows, Kinder Morgan wants to increase the capacity, double it, send a lot more oil tankers through the Port of Vancouver. There's a process that your government is now changing the environmental process. We have an interim process going through. The Premier of your province has said there's so many conditions that need to be satisfied before I'll sign off on it. So let me put you on the spot. If her process is in place, if the Premier of British Columbia says it's a go, will Vision Vancouver, you and Mayor Robertson, maybe you shouldn't answer Mayor Robertson, but would a pipeline, is there any conditions under which you could see you saying, that's okay, Kinder Morgan can put more tankers through the Port of Vancouver? Does that work in any scenario?
None, and we've been very clear about that. Not just a government, a unanimous vote of council.
Right, so don't make the case for it, then why is it important then if there's no conditions, then why is it even important that Minister McKenna change or her government change an approval process?
We haven't been lobbying for that for exactly that reason. The time and energy that we have put into this pipeline debate, the amount of hours that activists and governments and First Nations, the amount of renewable energy that we could have facilitated and enabled instead of having this debate is incredible, right? It's not an ideological position. We spent 2 years doing the research on a variety of fronts. We had 13 areas that we did the research on, one of which was rejected by the NEB, which was the climate-causing impacts of burning liquid tar. In addition to other concerns we had about safety in water, about hazardous spills, about the impact on our economy, both in the event of a spill, but just Our brand as a city, we did a brand valuation as part of our submission to the NEB National Energy Board process. Our brand is worth $31.5 billion as a city, the city of Vancouver. It's largely based on clean and green. Just having a major oil port there, because it's not a doubling, the pipeline is twinned, the new pipeline would have a 7-fold capacity increase over what's there. We would be one of the largest oil ports on the planet. That damage that it would do to our brand, even without a spill, is immense. A spill would pretty much wipe out the brand of the city of Vancouver. So way too much risk, no benefit on a planet that is dying because we're burning fossil fuels. So the answer seems fairly clear. Let's put our energy into a debate about renewable energy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that... And this is the challenge now, and this is where I'm sort of segueing to you, Minister McKenna, because we've heard from your government, it's not either or. We can have our energy cake, I might be paraphrasing a bit, but we can have our energy cake and kind of eat it with some green icing too. In the sense that your government is not against, we're not going to shut down the oil sands, we are going to try and find a way to responsibly move tar and oil to market somehow, some way. It doesn't look like Councillor Reimer wants it to come west. It's probably going to come east. But how do we, as a country, sort this out? And I think you've sold that we got to be credible on climate change first, and then we can start talking about energy?
No, look, is it a hard conversation? Yes. And I get this question all the time. And I mean, probably Shannon's better to answer it from Alberta's perspective.
I'm going to come to her in a minute.
Yeah. So she can provide a perspective, but we need transition to a low carbon economy. We absolutely do, but we can't do it. We can't do it overnight. And I'm a realist on this. There are a lot of people who have lost jobs in Alberta. I'm not saying that means, that we destroy our planet, but I think we need to be thoughtful about how we move forward. And I also am very acutely aware in my position that if we, in some ways I'm preaching to the converted here. Everyone here believes that climate change is a massive problem. We've got to do something right now. There's a lot of people that aren't there, that are a little bit there, who want to see action. But if what we end up doing has a huge, immediate, dislocating effect on the economy where tons of people lose jobs, I'm losing everyone. I'm losing them. And what we are doing with our environmental assessment process, and I'm not prejudging what happens or what projects go through, the whole reason to have an environmental assessment process is that you have a process and you go through it and you look at what the impact is on the environment, you have consultations, you engage with Indigenous communities who often want to develop too. We can't prejudge how they're going to end up in something, and that's how you move forward. And that's why it's so important what we have said. We need to rebuild trust in our environmental assessment process, because I think this is part of the problem. And I totally get you. Like, the idea there would ever be any kind of spill, outside of, in the waters outside of Vancouver is petrifying. So that's why you need to look at that. And it may be that the outcome is you absolutely can't do it. But I think you need to be thoughtful and have a proper process. And we need to look at how are we bringing everyone together and how are we transitioning to this low carbon economy in a way that I can keep everyone on board and that we actually have the money that we can do the transitioning. And so I think that we are doing everything we can. We sent the signals in our budget. We are now working with each province. It is exactly like Paris. Let me tell you that when you have countries that are, the Albertas of the world, and you have countries that are the Marshall Islands, like, PEI. And every economy is different. And we need to be working with labor. We need to be working with faith groups. We need to be working with municipalities. We need to be working with provincial governments. We need to be working with Canadians to find thoughtful solutions with difficult choices, but getting everyone to feel together so it's not just people in this room, so that it's everyone working towards lowering our emissions. And I will say, though that is not an excuse. That is not saying that we aren't going to take tough measures. But this is about doing this in a thoughtful way, working with the different parties involved.
Having tried to get everybody to buy in, at some point I wonder, would your government be prepared to say, let's take this majority out for a spin? You've seen the polls, your Prime Minister is tremendously popular. Just do it. You have the numbers in Parliament, why not just do it?
Look, so as I've said, at the end of the day, we need to meet our international commitments, and we are going to meet our international commitments. But we are working with the provinces and territories and the municipalities because we want everyone to be there with us, and we need to understand what will the impact be of certain things. So I hear from the northern communities, from the territories, you bring in a carbon price, we can't afford our food. That's an important message. So we need to be thoughtful. You can't just go and do things and assume the federal government knows best. And that's actually been a really good way to split up our country. So I don't want this to be a national unity crisis. I get nervous about the way the conversation sometimes goes, that it's East versus West, it's different groups. I don't think that that's a positive way forward. That doesn't mean at the end of the day that we're a regulator. There are measures we absolutely can take, but I would like to go through the proper process and have the conversation and then figure out what is the best way forward.
And I'm going to maybe finish with Minister Phillips on this end, picking up on national unity and Alberta's central role and, as the nexus on this climate change, energy, environment thing. There was a thinking here in Ottawa for a time that Alberta, in good faith, Premier Notley's government had taken great strides on showing Albertans could be environmental leaders, and that when everyone in the rest of the country saw Alberta being environmental leaders, we'd let pipelines go through, it would all be good, we'd have the whole package. And of course, it didn't happen that way. We saw Mayor Coderre and other leaders in Eastern Canada, they're saying no pipeline, no way, no how. Do Albertans feel a bit like, what do you got to do to get a little bit of respect in the rest of the Confederation? I mean, what's it like trying to govern in Alberta where you're trying to be green, but you've got those jobs, as you set it up in your opening, you need those energy jobs.
Well, I think on this question of transition that there's no question that we are moving towards a carbon-constrained future. But the reason why I highlighted the economic challenges in Alberta right now is that a transition that is not thoughtful and an approach in the Canadian economy is not thoughtful will take the current social dislocation and inequality and people losing their jobs en masse and collapse of communities we are seeing in Alberta right now and make it worse, and that is not the way that we are going to proceed. So it's really, really, really important for Canadians to appreciate what we have in Alberta, which is we have one commodity, one price, one market. And that is what has led us to this place where we have now lost $10 billion of our revenue, and we are having a hard time ensuring that we don't have really, really big social problems as a result of this. And so we need to understand the human element. Albertans and workers are part of your Canadian family, and they deserve your support.
All right.
Having said that, we will commit to diversify and reinvesting the fiscal capacity generated through the carbon levy for the economy that we know is coming at us as Albertans, whether we like it or not.
All right. Councillor Shannon Phillips, Minister Shannon Phillips, Councillor Andrea Reimer, Minister Catherine McKenna, thank you so much, all three of you, for traveling as far as you did, for being here today. Thank you very much.